Once upon a time, there was a man named Charles Turner. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country, known for his vast empire of luxury hotels and his sharp business acumen. But despite his enormous wealth, Charles was lonely. His towering mansions felt cold. His expensive cars were mere shells of joy, and the people around him only saw his money. He knew that most of those who flocked to him were there because of his riches, not for who he truly was. At 38, Charles was at the pinnacle of success, but deep inside, he felt a void he couldn't fill. His heart longed for a love that wasn't tainted by the greed and superficiality of the world around him. It was then that he met her. Emily Rose was unlike anyone Charles had ever encountered. She was quiet, thoughtful, and carried an air of grace that seemed untouched by the harsh realities of the world. Emily had lost her sight in a tragic accident when she was just a child, but she never let her blindness define her. Instead, she lived her life with an independence and resilience that fascinated Charles. She worked as a music teacher at a small community center, and despite her lack of wealth or high social status, Emily was content with her life. Charles first saw her at a charity gala, where she had been invited to play the piano. He was captivated by her music, but even more so by her presence. She radiated a kindness and authenticity that was so rare in his world. After her performance, Charles found a way to introduce himself, and to his surprise, Emily didn't seem to care about his wealth or status. She couldn't see the opulence around him. She only listened to his voice, felt his kindness, and sensed the man behind the money. Over time, Charles and Emily grew closer. They would take long walks together, talk for hours, and share moments that felt genuine. Emily saw Charles in a way that no one else ever had, not for his riches, but for the man he truly was. And for the first time in his life, Charles felt truly seen. However, Charles had a secret. While he appeared to the world as a powerful, confident man, he was hiding something beneath his well-tailored suits and charming smile. Charles had been severely disfigured in a fire many years ago. His face bore deep scars, and he had never fully recovered emotionally from the trauma. He was ashamed of how he looked and feared that people would judge him if they knew the truth. For years, Charles had hidden his scars from the world, using his wealth and power as a shield. He surrounded himself with people who either didn't care or didn't dare to ask about the accident. But now, with Emily, everything was different. She couldn't see his scars, and that was part of what drew him to her. He didn't have to hide. She would never judge him for something she couldn't see. As their relationship deepened, Charles found himself falling in love with Emily. She brought light into his life, and for the first time, he considered the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by his scars. But as much as he loved her, Charles knew he was living in fear that if Emily ever regained her sight, she would see the truth and be repelled by his appearance. When Charles proposed to Emily, she was overjoyed. She had come to love him deeply, not for his wealth, but for the way he made her feel safe, cherished, and loved. Charles, however, was filled with a mixture of joy and dread. He wanted to marry her, to be with her forever, but he was haunted by the fear that their love was built on a foundation of deceit. After their wedding, Charles tried to push his fears aside and focus on the life they were building together. They moved into a beautiful estate on the outskirts of the city, where Emily continued to teach music and Charles managed his business empire. Their life seemed perfect from the outside, but inside, Charles's guilt gnawed at him. One evening, after returning from a business trip, Charles found Emily sitting by the piano, her fingers lightly brushing over the keys. She looked peaceful, but there was a sadness in her face that Charles hadn't noticed before. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Emily hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Charles, I've been thinking. There's a new surgery available. Could restore my sight." Charles's heart stopped. The words he had dreaded for so long were finally spoken. He felt a wave of panic wash over him. If Emily regained her sight, she would see him, truly see him. She would see the scars he had hidden for so long, and Charles couldn't bear the thought of her looking at him with pity, or worse, disgust. For a moment, Charles considered dissuading her. telling her that the surgery was too risky or that it wasn't worth it. But he knew he couldn't do that. Emily had always been independent, always striving for more in her life. How could he deny her the chance to see the world again, just because of his own insecurities? I think it's wonderful, Charles finally said, though his voice trembled. If this is something you want, I'll support you. Emily smiled, though Charles could see that she sensed his hesitation. I love you, Charles, and no matter what happens, that won't change. Her words were meant to comfort him, but they only deepened his fear. What if she didn't love him anymore once she saw the truth? The weeks leading up to the surgery were filled with tension. Charles tried to act normal, to support Emily as best as he could, but inside he was falling apart. Every night, he lay awake, imagining the moment she would open her eyes and see his disfigured face for the first time. Would she still love him, or would she look at him with horror and regret? The day of the surgery arrived, and Charles accompanied Emily to the hospital. He held her hand as she was wheeled into the operating room, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. Everything would change after this. Hours passed, and finally, the surgeon came out to inform Charles that the operation had been a success. Emily would need time to heal, but she would regain her sight within a few days. Charles felt a mixture of relief and terror. He was happy for Emily, but he knew that the moment he had feared for so long was fast approaching. When Emily's bandages were removed, she blinked her eyes, adjusting to the light. Charles stood in the corner of the room, his heart racing. He wanted to run, to hide, but he couldn't. He owed it to Emily to face her, no matter what happened. Emily slowly turned her head toward him. At first, her expression was one of confusion as she adjusted to seeing after so many years. But then, as her eyes focused on Charles, a look of recognition spread across her face. "Charles?" she whispered. Her voice soft, he stepped forward, his entire body trembling. "Yes, it's me." For a long moment, Emily simply stared at him. Charles could feel his heart breaking. This was the moment he had dreaded. She was seeing him for the first time, scars and all. He braced himself for her reaction, expecting her to pull away, to look at him with disgust. But Emily did none of those things. Instead, she reached out and touched his face, her fingers gently tracing the lines of his scars. Tears filled her eyes, but they weren't tears of horror or pity. They were tears of love. "Charles," she said softly, "I see you. I've always seen you." And in that moment, Charles realized that his fears had been unfounded. Emily's love wasn't based on what she could or couldn't see. She loved him for who he was, scars and all. And for the first time in his life, Charles felt truly free. They embraced, and as they held each other, Charles knew that their love was stronger than any fear or insecurity. He had married Emily thinking she couldn't see him, but in reality, she had always seen him, more clearly than anyone else ever had. In the weeks following Emily's surgery, her recovery was nothing short of miraculous. She marveled at the world around her, rediscovering the colors, the shapes, and the faces of the people she had once known only through touch and sound. Every morning, she would rise with a newfound excitement, eager to experience life in ways she hadn't been able to for so long. Charles, however, found himself struggling with the intensity of his emotions. He was overjoyed that Emily's surgery had been successful, but the lingering weight of his insecurities remained. He had feared for so long that his appearance would change the way she felt about him, and while Emily had shown nothing but love and acceptance, a small part of him still doubted. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace of their sprawling estate, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Emily reached for Charles's hand. She could feel his tension, the way he seemed distant despite their closeness. "Charles," she began, her voice gentle, "I know you're still worried, but I meant what I said in the hospital. Nothing about you could ever make me love you any less." Charles turned to her, his eyes searching hers. He had been open with Emily about his fears before the surgery, but now that she could see him, he felt exposed in a way he never had before. His scars were no longer just physical marks. They were a symbol of the pain and shame he had carried with him for years. "It's not that I don't believe you, Emily," he said softly, his gaze dropping to the ground. It's just, I've hidden behind these walls for so long. I've built a life around my appearance, my wealth, because I thought that's all people saw. I don't know how to let that go. Emily squeezed his hand. You don't have to let anything go, she replied. You've been protecting yourself for so long, and I understand that. But I see beyond those scars, Charles. I always have. Charles smiled weakly, grateful for her words, but still unsure how to fully embrace this new chapter of their lives. He loved Emily more than he had ever thought possible, but the idea of being truly vulnerable with her, of allowing her to see every part of him, inside and out, terrified him. In the months that followed, life slowly began to settle into a new routine. Emily resumed her teaching at the community center, where the children were overjoyed to see her and amazed by her transformation. Charles, meanwhile, immersed himself in his work, using it as a distraction from the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. But despite his best efforts to focus on his business, Charles couldn't escape the feeling that something was missing. He had everything he had ever wanted: success, wealth, and now, a woman who loved him unconditionally. But the scars of his past, both physical and emotional, continued to haunt him. One evening, after returning home late from the office, Charles found Emily sitting in the living room, a stack of photographs spread out on the coffee table in front of her. She had been looking through old family albums, something she had wanted to do ever since regaining her sight. Charles hesitated for a moment in the doorway, watching her as she gently traced her fingers over the faces in the pictures. Do you recognize them? He asked quietly, stepping into the room. Emily looked up, a smile spreading across her face. I do, she said. It's strange. I remember the way they felt, but seeing them now, it's like I'm meeting them all over again. Charles sat down beside her, glancing at the photos. There were images of Emily as a child, her parents, friends she hadn't seen in years. And then, toward the bottom of the pile, there was a photograph that made Charles's heart stop. It was an old picture of himself, taken years before the fire that had left him scarred. He stared at the image in silence. The young man in the photograph almost unrecognizable to him now. His skin was smooth, his smile confident. He looked carefree, unburdened by the weight of the world that had since settled on his shoulders. I almost forgot what I used to look like, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Emily turned her gaze to him, her eyes soft. I didn't marry that man, she said, her hand resting on his. I married the man you are now, the one who's strong enough to face his fears, who's kind, and who's built a life out of love, not just money. Charles swallowed hard, his throat tightening. But what if I'm not enough? He whispered, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at him for so long. What if all I am is my scars? Emily shook her head, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. Your scars don't define you, Charles. They're a part of you, yes, but they're not the whole story. I see you for who you are, every part of you. And I love you, not despite those scars, but because of who you've become because of them. Her words hit Charles like a wave, washing over him and breaking down the walls he had spent years building. In that moment, something inside him shifted. For so long, he had allowed his fear of rejection to control him, to dictate how he lived his life. But now, sitting beside Emily, he realized that the only person who had been rejecting him was himself. He had been so focused on hiding his scars, on protecting himself from the judgment of others, that he hadn't allowed himself to truly live. But Emily's love, her unconditional, unwavering love, had shown him that he didn't have to hide anymore. He could be himself, scars and all, and still be worthy of love. For the first time in years, Charles felt a sense of peace settle over him. He looked at Emily, his heart swelling with gratitude for the woman who had seen past the walls he had built, who had loved him for the man he truly was. I don't deserve you, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Emily smiled, her eyes shining with tears. Yes, you do, and I deserve you too. We deserve each other, Charles, in every way. They sat together in silence for a long time, their hands entwined, the weight of the past slowly lifting. Charles knew that his journey wasn't over, that there would still be moments of doubt, of fear, But for the first time in his life, he felt like he didn't have to face those fears alone, with Emily by his side. He could face anything as the years passed. Charles and Emily built a life together that was filled with love, laughter, and joy. They traveled the world, experiencing it through both Emily's newfound sight and Charles's renewed sense of freedom. They gave back to their community, opening a foundation to help others who had been affected by trauma, and together, they showed the world that true beauty came not from appearances, but from the strength of the heart. And through it all, Charles finally learned the most important lesson of all, that love wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about hiding your flaws or pretending to be someone you're not. True love was about being seen, fully and completely, and knowing that you were enough, just as you were. In Emily's eyes, Charles had always been enough. And now, finally, he could see it too.